now that I've thoroughly inconvenienced the cat. Hello everybody, and welcome back to Whimsy and Metaphor Ride Along Club, where we bring you only the most professional use of green screen. So last time we talked about names. We've now got everything set up. I will go over the document in just a second, but this time we're going to actually start putting some words into the outline like I've been promising that we will do for at least the last 4 episodes. I genuinely apologize for that. I always forget to add on the fact that I've got to make words with my face out loud to other human beings as part of this process. But we're on the outline now, so let us keep going. But before I do start into that, I want to spend 10 minutes maximum at the start of this episode. There were 2 things that I've flagged in previous episodes that I wanted to talk about when they became relevant, and they've just become relevant. So the first one was last week I talked about iterative processes of doing this outlining, and this is also how I do the first draft. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about that process. The other one was that I mentioned a while back, I think it was while we were timelining, everyone gets stuck on the first scene, right? And it's hard. You don't have that momentum yet. Knowing where to start can be pretty tricky. I wanted to have a chat about the first scene that we've picked and why. So between recordings, I have put that names database that we came up with into this cache folder. I can update that as needed. And we've got this 1 to 10 here because I had a little bit of a think about whether I was going to set up chapters right from the get-go. And the thing I was tossing up there is that chapters are good for ease of reading convenience. The trade-off for that is that chapters will silo that action a little bit. It will force me to make deliberate resting points. And because this is intended to become quite chaotic, it is intended to be a little bit, everything's happening for everyone all at once all the time. I was questioning whether I wanted chapters at all. And because this is relatively short, it's only 20 to 30,000 words, I don't need chapters as a way to break up the story quite so badly as if I were doing a novel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start writing. I'm going to see how it turns out. If it turns out that there are actually some really nice chapters, I can put those in. If it turns out I need chapters and the benefit that I'm getting from not having chapters from a thematic perspective isn't outweighing that need, then I'll put chapters in. Otherwise, I've just started to put in this 1 to 10 system as a way to keep it readable for me in this section here. It's just a way for me to kind of make it easy for me to see where things are, what's going on, how long is it now, without having to scroll up and down in this main page quite so much. And the thing that I did not put in that I want to do now is I'm going to add myself a deleted scenes. And what I'm going to do with that is as I go, if I have any scenes that I put in as a placeholder or I decide need to change or that can be combined into other scenes, I'll pop them in there so that if I need to go back and cannibalize little bits of them, if it turns out that that scene is good, it just needs to go in a different place, or if it turns out I need to reference what I said earlier, they're all there. I haven't lost anything. So, second thing that I wanted to talk about, because I think this is the one that I can get done super quickly, is talking about that iterative process. I went on a long rant in one of the previous episodes about how I think that iterative processes are better for making the final product of a story the best thing that it can be. In this section, I want to also talk about iterative processes, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically, and I want to use a different definition. So now when I'm talking about this outline and first draft process, when I say iteration, basically what I mean is that I work to a point, I go back and fix things as I go, rather than continuing to work through and fixing things all at the end. I think iterative is kind of the wrong word here. If I come up with a better one, I will let you know before the end of this rant. The reason that I do this, and I think I may have briefly mentioned this, but I want to go over it again in case someone is coming to this as the first video that they've watched. This is the topic that they want to know about. I'll just go over it really quick. Basically, I used to have a lot of trouble with first drafts. I used to hate them. I used to follow the advice that people give to new writers quite a lot, which is don't think about editing. Separate your editing and your creative brain. Remember that you can edit at the end, but while you're doing the first draft, keep looking forward, because otherwise you'll get stuck tweaking and updating and fixing, and you're never going to move forward, which I think was actually very good advice for me at the time. Never let it be said that that was not useful advice, and actually I give that advice to a lot of other people. However, with a little bit more experience, I've found that that actually makes the first draft process absolutely horrible for me, because what it means is that I start writing the first draft, I identify some problems, and then I'm faced with a choice. If I'm not going to go back and fix them, right, I can either continue forward as I was going to, knowing that the more that I write, the more I'm going to have to change things. Or I can continue forward as if I had already made those changes. And that makes me feel very unmoored. Either way, I know I'm going back and I'm making a lot of extra work for myself. And that is the one thing that will kill my motivation quicker than anything else, is redoing things or knowing that I'm making problems for myself to solve later. I started to do a process of when I identify a problem, I go back and I fix it. I change the outline going forward. I change the scenes that I've already written going back if it's a first draft, or I go back and change the outline and then write forward from there, making updates in my basic timeline if I need to. And what that does is it stops me from getting writer's block. It stops me from getting stuck at places in the story where I know that I know what comes next. I just can't put it down on the page for some reason. And even though it does result in the first draft and the outline taking a lot more actual time when I'm working on them, I found that the overall time, if I just take the chronological when did I start, when did I finish time, is basically the same. And it's also cut down on the amount of editing that I need to do, because I'm solving a lot of the problems as I go. I'm not leaving as much work for myself in those editing drafts. So what you'll see me do in this section is you'll see me do the outline, make a realization, and then spend some time going back over and fixing and tweaking and making all those continuity edits. And then I'll keep going from where I left off. And the second thing that I want to talk about, which is actually going to lead us directly into putting some words in this document, so yay for forward planning, is that first scene. Why this as a first scene? And the first scene is often very contentious. It's a struggle for a lot of people. And there is an extent to which that is warranted. There is also an extent to which that is kind of overblown. Yes, the first scene and the first line do play a role in telling the reader what they can expect from here on out. And if you're not writing a fan fiction or a sequel, you are often coming in having to bring the reader up to speed on literally everything, especially if you're writing a speculative fiction. Not only about the characters, but about the world that they live in, about the way that things work in this environment. You have to clearly signal genre and tone and all of these other things. And that can be pretty daunting, right? It is also necessary to make it be punchy and snappy and attention grabbing, because this is the point where the reader is figuring out whether they like the book or not. And while I think it is a little bit overblown that the first line has so much attention put on it, a reader can look at a first line and go, oh, okay, no, I need this. I need to read this. If you can have it, great, good on you. If not, it's actually not the end of the world. You can have just a decent first line, because the reader will go, they might not go, oh, heck yes, no, I'm hooked. But they will probably go, oh yeah, okay. And then they'll read the rest of the paragraph. They'll read the rest of the first page, and then they'll make the decision. And I think that's something that struggles to get articulated. People kind of fall back on this, oh, it's got to grab the reader, it has to be punchy, it has to be this, it has to be that, can't have info dumps, can't have whatever. And I think what people are often actually searching for is a way to express it has to give the reader a good and concise sense of what they're in for and why. And that is a much more relaxed mandate than having to grab the reader straight up, right? Because one, you're not going to grab every single reader. You're not pulling out a bunch of tricks in the first chapter to trick the reader into thinking that they are going to have an enjoyable experience for the rest of the book, right? In fact, that's actually probably a bad thing, because if you use all of those tricks and you do grab a reader for whom this is not the thing that they signed up for, or not the thing that they wanted to read, then they're going to feel betrayed. Or if you're using a bunch of these gimmicks, you risk the reader putting the book down anyway, because they're going, okay, great, I see all of these tricks, but you haven't told me about you, or you haven't told me what I need to expect. That's what your opening scene should do, or your opening chapter, or whatever scale you're working on. And you see a lot of discussion, especially in the fantasy genre, right, about not putting in info dump. I think that's one of those very interesting debates. In the fantasy genre, there is a kind of genre awareness. The reader knows that they're about to be put into a secondary world. They know that they want information first up about what's going on, and they're willing to let you be a little bit unnatural to deliver it if that's what needs to happen. Much more so than, say, a thriller reader who wants to get to the action as quickly as possible, or a mystery reader who maybe feels like they should be able to put those clues together from context as part of the puzzle. Some readers absolutely love you for writing 3-page essays at the start of the story. That is their bread and butter. If that's your niche, go for them. But at the same time, I acknowledge that I am a reader that is perfectly happy going, all right, I don't understand this yet, but I'm going to give the author 5 chapters. The genre niche that I prefer to fill is very much for people that are either preferring to sit back and let that information come in pieces. They like feeling like the author is giving them a little puzzle, or they like feeling like the author, I don't think this is a good way to phrase it always. In some cases, it's phrased as that the author respects their intelligence enough to not feel like they need to give them every single minute detail up front. And I do resonate with that explanation, but I also feel like in some cases it's a bit unfair, because if an author does put in that essay because they think the reader will be equally interested in the world building as the story, I don't think that's disrespecting that reader's intelligence at all. However, it is also possible to write that big info dump in a way that really does disrespect the reader's intelligence. That's all about how you deliver it, though. There is kind of a perception that you should start the inciting incident as close to the start as possible, even with starting with the inciting incident, right? Like, a mystery novel starts with the detective looking at a dead body on the floor, or with the mysterious femme fatale walking into the detective's office with a job proposition, right? We start with things changing. And you can do that in fantasy as well, right? You can start with the invasion. You can start with whatever it happens to be. Or you can start with this sort of day in the life scene going in. And I think there is something to be said about authors falling back on that day in the life scene because it kind of gives them somewhere to ramp up from, or because they do feel like they need that info dump in order to bring the reader up to speed. And sometimes that's true, sometimes that's because that writer is not confident. But I think the real trade-off is not how close is this to the start of the story? How quickly can I get to this incident? The trade-off is actually how much impact will that inciting incident have if I don't establish a normal going forward. Going back to that detective novel, that noir novel, the moment the femme fatale walks in the door has the job proposition. You are working in a very established genre, with very established setting, with very established character roles. Even if it is the first book in a series, and you are introducing new readers to this character, you don't have to do that by showing a normal day in the life. because there is a lot of information that the reader can just infer from genre literacy and roll into that story, noting the places where you choose to differ from the template. However, if you do have a really secondary world story that is not in a very established genre, then adding that day in the life scene may actually be super necessary for that inciting incident to have weight. Say you're dealing with someone who is middle management in a government system, and you have a really detailed world building element of that government system that is different to the system that most of your readers you expect to work under, or different to other fantasy genres that have been established. So in my case, it's not Australian or American modern government systems, and it's also not a medieval fantasy version of feudalism. I may have to put in that day in the life section because when the character receives a missive that something's gone wrong in one of the provinces, that is very based in that knowledge of who is responsible for what in this system, I need to establish that first, because otherwise the reader might genuinely be lost and that scene loses impact. That's the other thing, is I'm not necessarily going for a story where it feels like things are normal and then they change. I'm going for a story in which things are already abnormal and they're about to get even worse. So dumping the reader in without that kind of security of the understanding of what's normal is very much mirroring what the characters are feeling. That gives you that sense of tone, starting scenes earlier. If you have that normal day, you're establishing that things are normal currently, which may or may not be the vibe that you want to give. And that is, I think, something that conversations about the inciting incident do often gloss over. A lot of them do very much conceptualize the story as beginning when normal breaks, which is a really good way to start thinking about story structure. A really good place to start a story is the first time something happens that is going to change something fundamentally. That's compelling. It's a really good framework to start to apply when you're early on in thinking about these things. But I also think that it's worth noting that that is only one of several options. There are other places to start a story. There are other structures to use that will give you a different tone. And one of the ways that you can start to get to the next level in thinking about how do I start a story? Where do I start writing about this? Is thinking, okay, but what is a different way to frame this than protagonist starts at normal and then things change? So when I put in this scene in the opening of the timeline, I said, I think this is our first scene, but I'm going to explain why later. Now is later. And I realized that this was something that I did kind of intuitively. This is very much one of those things that I've learned how to do, but I haven't yet learned how to express. So why is this the first scene? Taking that path that I'm now thinking down of, okay, how much info needs to be dumped in that first scene. I know I've talked a lot about drawing very much from historical sources, so revolutions and things like that. So I know I do have real world anchors to be drawing from. But I also know that they are not as common in my genre as other systems of government might be. So I do need to do a little bit of structure going in here. I know that the world itself is secondary world, and there's a lot of background to do with this. Who are the dead people? How have they come back and why? And that is something that I'll need to go into pretty quickly and do a lot of detail about, and maybe even have to just step back and go, okay, reader, I need to bring you up to speed. Here's some info. We'll see how far I can get without doing that, but it may need to happen. But the actual world itself, I'm not needing to build in any secondary world ecologies. I'm not needing to build in non-human characters. I need to do some world building, but it's very specific. And my inciting incidents don't require a lot of backstory. Here, the inciting incident is man, for want of a better word, in a silly costume, goes and finds a dead monarch and has a conversation. No matter what background you're coming from, right? That feels like shit's about to go down. But a lot more information needs to be conveyed a lot more quickly in that government section, which means that I'm actually going to start putting in some other scenes here, and you're going to see why. I feel like there are ways to do that in the first scene, absolutely, but I feel like this is also the stronger start, purely thinking about the amount of information that needs to be conveyed. As I've said several times now, as much as a lot of that planning has gone into this government structure because it is the thing that needs the most detail, the knowledge that the dead people are back and those themes and this kind of government ideological struggle is actually the real core of the story. The detail on the politics is just the vehicle through which all of these other things are being told. So I actually don't want to start with the politics, partially because it doesn't let me give as much space to the tone. And it doesn't let me give as much space to that ideological framework of the story. It forces me to spend all of my time attempting to make the government positions really digestible. I'm not going to give these titles yet because I don't know what happens in them. I actually want to have several scenes sitting with this government stuff. And the reason that I want to do that, I almost want to treat this opening scene as a prologue. I want to have this opening scene as, here's a character. They're not going to be relevant for a little while. Here is a really messed up supernatural thing that's happening. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Hey, look at all of these government things that are going on. Hey, look at all of this shiny, dangle the keys. Because I think that is going to really add to that sense of tension that the reader feels in that first section. If you remember, we talked about this when I was making that first timeline. The structure and the timeline that I'm thinking of is very much, you have a starting point and you have that section where everybody is kind of doing a lot and not getting very far. And the tone is very tense but very frustrated. I can't get that sense without giving the reader the impression that there's a time limit. But I also can't give a very strong external time limit, say there's an invasion about to happen. The Dark Lord is going to regain power and return. Those very explicit stakes actually don't serve that tone very well, because if you have those explicit stakes, then the next question obviously becomes, well, why aren't the characters doing something about it? You go from, man, it sucks that everybody is so frustrated, to that sense that you just want to reach through the page and tell the characters, hey, you need to get your shit together. Even though we know as adults that the characters don't have all the information that we do, there is a tension there where the reader will still instinctively feel like the characters, if they were making the best decisions possible, would be doing more, if there are those external stakes. And also that sense of, why are those characters not prioritizing this? Why is Thomas not putting aside all of these ideological things in order to tell Gadner what's going on if they have this history where they were friends once? That paints Thomas in a very different light. But if I have this opening where we know that people are doing things, but it's not clear what, it's not clear why, and it's not clear exactly what implications and effects that will have, that lets the reader on a sense of tension in the background that the other main characters, that Gadner is not necessarily privy to yet, in a way that doesn't feel frustrating, in a way that does not reflect on the abilities or the intelligence or the priorities of these characters, which is a really difficult balancing act, right? You're never going to hit that balancing act perfectly for every person, but that is the balancing act that I'm kind of thinking of. So let's go into here, a section which I usually don't use, but I do want to this time just to sort of bring some things out and make some things explicit. All right, so back now that I've got that list written up at the bottom there, I've got a quick list at the top of the things that this scene needs to do to start. So it's got the characters that we need to introduce, and the thing that this scene is really doing is it's establishing tone, it's establishing world in general, and it also has to show the ideological issues between Thomas and Gadner, but between Thomas and someone who we don't know yet. So let me translate that now into how this opening scene is actually going to go. I don't want to think about this too much in terms of movies, because this is not a movie, this is a novella. Keeping that in mind, I'm going to say that in my head, this first section includes like an establishing shot. And I'm borrowing from movie terminology there to talk about something that you can actually translate. The feeling I'm going for is something that's a little bit more detached from the rest of the story, that's a little bit more, it's a little bit bigger than the characters that are in it. I'm not going to start off with sort of describe the environment and then come into the characters. Not that kind of establishing shot, but I do definitely think there is a place in this first paragraph or so to really capture the breadth of the scene. So where does this start? This starts on a road. Actually, no, I think this starts at a cave. Now there's a decision that I have to make here. I want to make some decisions about the entrance to this place that sets it apart from that scene in Lord of the Rings where Minas Morgul appears, while also delivering on a lot of the same vibes. And we are talking about something that does have to be distinct from the real world, right? We're talking about something that's kind of afterlifey but not quite. So I think this shadowy area is important. I had this initial idea of this starting off with Thomas on that road that we talked about last week, progressing into this area, but I think bringing that in later when the reader understands Thomas a little more will let me get that juxtaposition better. And also it will create a little bit of a sense of irony in that Thomas hasn't realized that his self-image is extremely different to his establishing shots. I think that's a very fun idea to play with. We could have him literally entering a mausoleum. We could have him literally entering a grave area, something like that. I'm not sure that that will work. We could go with ancient burial mound. I think that's a little bit on the nose. Where would they have come back to? Maybe it is a burial mound. Ancient grave site of some description. Oh, damn. Okay. How do I do this? Could be forest. Sorry, let me step back. So, what if entrance to where the City of the Dead is on an old mass grave? Plague, war, whatever it happens to be. I'll decide that later. Mass grave, which means it's going to be far away from water sources. It's going to be far away from towns, unless the towns have encroached on it since then, which is possible. I think he's not too far from a town. But that means there's no structure there. That means there's nothing to walk through or anything like that. We could be getting into forest clearing area, which is where I was at before. I'm looking at what other natural formations around the place there could be. I'm also now thinking of ways that he might get into the City of the Dead, which is going to be sort of its own thing. I think there is a sense that this is a thing that you have to understand how to traverse, which I think is going to come back and be a really interesting character note. Okay, we've got this space, we've got this person in it who is very clearly not dressed for traveling, or who thinks he is dressed for traveling. I'm actually going to add something here, not necessarily obsession with appearance. I'm going to actually say that this is this just because this is how this person dresses normally, or is he about to be in a situation? How does the door open? Guide comes, door magically opens, zombie hand through ground. Okay, we've got it. So Thomas is going to follow some people into the City of the Dead. We've got a couple of things that I want to point out that I'm putting in here that are going to be important. When he stands up, he reveals that he's sitting against this engraving that tells you what this grave was all about. I'm seeding in a little bit of information here about Thomas and his attitudes and his themes and all of that sort of thing. Just hints and nudges in particular directions. The next part that's important, we don't get to see the people, so we don't know they're dead yet. Then we get this switch of world as Thomas walks into the ground in the remnants of whatever these people did to let themselves into the city, and in this very sort of sneaky way. I'm actually going to gloss over the next section because I think there'll be a lot of stuff that's conveyed in the writing here. However, this section, for the outline, there's nothing I need to know that's set up. The only thing that's really important is noting Thomas's attitude, because that's going to inform how I describe the scene, and that's going to inform how Thomas gets read. Now we're going to get to confrontation. Another one that I'm just going to gloss over for now and come back later. How does he convince them to let him see the Queen? Maybe I do come back to this before I finished writing this scene. For now, there's other things on my mind. I just want to get through that. And I think the answer to the question I've just asked myself is potentially yes, but it's going to take a little bit of finagling. But I'll leave that to myself to do later. Queen's met Thomas, and we get this description of the Queen. And the important part about the description of the Queen is the clothes. This is what is going to clue in the reader to who this is, as well as Thomas's reaction. And I've made a little note. Thomas and the Queen are very much drawing from the same visual language in how they present themselves. This is going to give us information both about the Queen and about Thomas, but I know that the reader won't necessarily pick up on it now. That's just going to have to be something that I build into the world as something that some people will get, some people won't. Some people might get it on second reading. Some people will get it because they have watched this video before reading the books. Whatever way, this is not going to be something that is thematically important enough for me to really emphasize it, but it is tonally important for me to get it right. So now we get to the part where they first meet. I'm going to have Thomas be quite formal. He's playing this role. He wants to get the Queen on side, so he's in full I'm talking to a Queen mode. The Queen doesn't need to be. And then we get to the part where we see that they do know each other. So they're putting on this very formal show for each other, even though they do actually have some familiarity. And that's going to imply a personal dynamic as well. Okay, so that's our first scene. So after this moment of recognition, the Queen leads Thomas to a place that is private, but it's not personal. Again, she's holding him very much at a distance this whole time. They small talk. He keeps pushing to get her interested in what he's interested in, and she keeps rebuffing those advances. All of this is done under the table. This is all unstated, implicit dynamics. The other thing that this section is doing is telling the reader what's going on in other places. Thomas is trying to entice the Queen with news that the reader is going to get very interested in very quickly. And part of the reason that I haven't described exactly what news it is here is I think that's going to develop as I start talking about this scene. So then she starts to get tired of him. He starts to push too hard. He starts to go into theatre mode, and she shuts that down immediately. He's frustrated. He tries to do a little bit of a push thing. He tries to talk to her about her people and ask what she's doing about them, and she has not a bar of this, nor does she need to. And that's the point at which the conversation ends. Thomas is politely but firmly shown out, and this whole thing stops. Now, none of this actually indicates what Thomas wanted in the first place, because the Queen is not interested in asking. Nor is it indicating that Thomas wanted to do anything. There is a lot in here about Thomas bidding for connection, not necessarily for action. So it could go either way at this point, which is important to maintaining that sense of, oh, but what was going on? Especially since these first few Gardner scenes just aren't going to mention this Queen at all. And that is clearly some stuff going on. That is clearly something the reader is interested in. And now I'm going to withhold that for a while. And in fact, I'm going to withhold that from you folks as well. And I'm going to address Gardner in the next one. So let me bring us back to here. And thank you so much for coming to this episode. For a brief moment, I thought I was going to be doing a stream after this episode. I think I'm not. I'm going to be doing a stream after the next episode. And I'll talk about that in that episode when I have a little bit of a better idea of what schedule that's on. But for now, thank you so much for coming. Whatever time of day it is, I hope you're having a good one. And I will see you next time.